Little House on the Prairie is a reminder of when things were simpler for us in our lives those 45 years ago.
For decades, one question has followed Melissa Gilbert everywhere she goes. What really happened between her and Dean Butler on the set of Little House on the Prairie? Fans have spent nearly 50 years convinced that Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder must have been in love off-camera too. The chemistry looked too real, the wedding scenes felt too tender, and the two actors stayed quiet for so long that silence itself became part of the legend. Now that Melissa has opened up in her own words, the story looks nothing like what audiences imagined, and in some ways it's more interesting than a romance they spent decades rooting for. To understand why people cared so much about Melissa and Dean, you have to remember what Little House on the Prairie meant to millions of households. The series followed the Ingalls family as they built a life out of very little, facing storms, sickness, and hardship with nothing but grit and love for each other. At the center of it all was Laura, a spirited young girl whose curiosity and heart carried the show through 9 seasons. Melissa Gilbert played her from the age of 9, and audiences watched her grow up in real time, week after week, until she felt like family to them. When Dean Butler joined the cast as Almanzo Wilder, the show gained its most iconic love story. Their courtship, their wedding, the quiet looks exchanged across the dinner table, all of it became appointment viewing. This was an era before social media, before behind-the-scenes clips and constant celebrity access. Audiences only had the episodes themselves and the occasional magazine interview, so they filled in the blanks with their imagination. If the actors wouldn't say whether something was going on between them, fans decided it must be true. That mystery kept the romance alive for generations, long after the cameras stopped rolling. Before any of that, though, Melissa Gilbert's life looked nothing like Laura's. Born in Los Angeles in 1964, she was adopted as an infant by actor Paul Gilbert and actress and dancer Barbara Crane, stepping into a show business family almost from birth. She was doing commercials by the time she was 7, and her natural, unforced screen presence made her stand out early. At 9 years old, she auditioned for the role that would define her, going up against dozens of other girls for the part of Laura Ingalls. What sealed her casting, according to Melissa herself, was her chemistry during a screen test with Michael Landon, who played her father Charles and also produced and directed much of the series. Landon became far more than a co-star to her. Off camera, he stepped into the role of a father figure at a point in her life when her adoptive parents' marriage was falling apart and her connection to her biological father had grown distant. She has spoken openly about how much his guidance shaped her and how his family, especially his daughter, became a second home for her during a confusing stretch of her childhood. That kind of stability mattered because being a child star came with pressures most kids never face. Melissa was memorizing pages of dialogue while other children were doing homework. She was expected to deliver raw, emotional performances on demand, then step back into ordinary life the moment the cameras stopped. Strangers treated her like she really was Laura Ingalls, sweet and simple and endlessly patient, when in reality, she was just a girl trying to figure out who she was underneath the braids and the sunbonnet. That identity struggle only deepened when Dean Butler arrived on set. Laura's storyline called for her first real romance, and the show leaned into it heavily, giving fans courtship, a proposal, and eventually a wedding. Off-screen, Melissa was still a young teenager who had never had a real boyfriend, being asked to convincingly play a woman falling in love with an adult man. She has since described how strange and uncomfortable that assignment felt for her at the time, even though Dean himself was consistently professional and considerate toward her. Their first on-screen kiss aired on national television, filmed with no history between them and no real off-camera spark to draw from. It was simply two performers doing their jobs in front of a crew and a script that demanded the appearance of devotion. Melissa has said that moment left her nervous and self-conscious rather than swept up in romance, which makes sense when you consider the age gap. She was around 15 at the time, while Dean was in his early 20s. That a difference audiences rarely thought about while watching the show, because the story sold itself as a timeless, wholesome love story rather than the awkward reality of two performers bridging a real generational gap. What fans never saw was how much effort went into making that romance believable despite the discomfort behind it. Dean has spoken about taking his responsibilities seriously, understanding that he was working opposite someone much younger and adjusting his approach accordingly. Rather than a secret romance, what actually existed between them was something closer to a working partnership built on mutual respect, with Dean treating Melissa more like a younger colleague he needed to protect than a romantic interest. Melissa herself has compared their relationship to a sibling bond rather than anything resembling the sweeping courtship their characters shared. Ironically, while millions of viewers wondered if Melissa and Dean were secretly together, her real teenage attention was elsewhere. She has spoken about the crush she carried during those years for a different young actor she would later date seriously once they were both a bit older. That detail alone reshapes the entire narrative fans built around the show. The romance audiences swore they could feel between Laura and Almanzo wasn't rooted in a real off-screen connection between the two leads at all. It was two skilled performers doing convincing work, supported by a story that gave audiences exactly what they wanted to believe. That doesn't mean nothing real existed between Melissa and Dean. It just wasn't romance. What they built instead was trust. Melissa has described feeling safe with him during a period when she was constantly being watched, judged, and asked to perform emotions she hadn't experienced yet in her own life. Dean gave her steadiness during scenes that could have easily felt exploitative given how young she was, and that steadiness turned into a genuine friendship that has lasted long after the series ended. The pressure Melissa faced didn't end when Little House wrapped. She has talked candidly about the toll of being seen as Laura Ingalls long after she'd outgrown the part, and about the ways Hollywood pushed her to transform her image once she moved into more adult roles. A high-profile part in the early 80s came with a demand for a glamorous, more overtly adult look, a sharp turn from the modest prairie dresses audiences knew her in. That shift brought new scrutiny of her appearance from both critics and fans, the kind of attention young actresses in that era were rarely equipped to handle gracefully. At 18, under that pressure, she chose to have cosmetic surgery, a decision she has since written about honestly, including the painful recovery and complications that followed. Years later, she added other cosmetic changes as she tried to meet an industry standard that often values how a woman looks over anything else she brings to a role. But by 2015, she had reversed course, having her implants removed and stepping away from the maintenance that came with trying to look a certain way. She has spoken since about rejecting the idea that aging is something to fight against, calling it instead a privilege, and has become an outspoken voice for accepting a natural appearance rather than chasing an artificial one. That arc, from a teenager reshaped by Hollywood's expectations to a woman reclaiming her own image on her own terms, says as much about her relationship with fame as anything that happened on set with Dean Butler. It's in her memoir, and in the interviews that followed its release, that Melissa finally addressed the decades of speculation directly. She has been blunt about how young and unprepared she felt being cast